In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
So hello, everybody. Welcome back to It's Not Just in Your Head. I'm Max Golding, a therapist, apparently. And who else do we have here? We have somebody named, what is it? Harriet Fraud?
Yes.
Harriet, who are you?
I am a mental health counselor and a hypnotherapist and a commentator on the intersection and mutual shaping of personal life and political and economic life. And we're lucky enough to have a guest.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tati Cosper. I am currently in Brooklyn, New York. I work for an anti-hunger nonprofit organization, and I also volunteer my time between two other organizations in the city, the Queer Detainee Empowerment Project and the Urban Indigenous Collective.
Well, we really welcome you because you're talking about a very, very important factor of this particular recession combined with pandemic. The United States never had those two. The Great Depression didn't have a pandemic. The Spanish flu didn't have a Great Depression. And we have two combined together. And the effect is a terrible incidence of hunger in the wealthiest country and the most armed country in the world, because we now have 1 out of 6 adults and about 1 out of 5 children who go hungry at least some of the time in a country where we throw away 31% of our food, which adds up to billions. 133 billion worth of food is thrown away. And the problem is not that we don't have enough food, because America has enough. There's very rich people. The problem is the distribution system. And as the SNAP help, the supplemental nutrition help, and the special school lunches have run out with the schools, and people are more and more desperate, we have a terrible, terrible epidemic of hunger, so that in the Bronx, which is the poorest borough of New York, and I see you come from New York, 38% of people go hungry sometimes. And so we're talking about an atrocity. And those are just statistics, which I find shocking, that hunger has gone up by 14 times since 2019, but they all have a personal cast and a mental health cast. And we're lucky enough that Tati brought this to our attention and can speak about it from her own experience.
Thank you for that introduction, Harriet. So I guess growing up, I grew up in a low-income household and experienced, I think something that isn't talked about enough in regards to hunger and poverty are the additional experiences that people have as a result of hunger and poverty, or at least a relationship or correlation between these two topics, is that a lot of people experience neglect and abuse as children. And, as those children eventually have families, they might become, those abusers. Or when it comes to food insecurity, people often have to do work that they might not want to do. And it's kind of like this real hustle mentality, especially with, getting SNAP and WIC and the availability of food to low-income families. And a lot of the times those programs don't provide enough money to low-income families because there's this kind of like food stamp cycle, I guess, or this like phenomenon where, people get their food stamp benefits or their SNAP benefits at the beginning of the month. And then as that money runs out, there's like a trend that like people kind of stop eating because there's no more money for those programs. But with my personal experience, I grew up in kind of like a food insecure household, and I experienced a lot of hunger and poverty. And, you know, a lot of the times I didn't actually know that I was experiencing hunger. I just thought it was kind of like the norm. And I remember being in high school, and like instead of eating, I would go out with my friends and we would take smoke breaks. And you know, my friends are also low income people. Yeah, well, they were at that time, and I mean, it kind of just started this like snowball effect of like unhealthy behaviors. And a lot of the times, you know, I wouldn't have the money in my, I guess, like lunch bank account, or I would be negative in the bank account often. And so if I wanted to get food, my lunch would actually get taken away by,
God.
I don't know, the lunch person or whoever's like operating that line. And so, yeah, there's like a huge issue with food insecurity, and also just like having lunch available to children growing up in schools and in the school system in the United States. And usually whenever I would get home, there would be, you know, there would be like frozen food in the freezer, or there wouldn't really be any food at all, or there would be like some canned foods. But I had a 2-parent household until I was 14, and my dad had like a really bad stroke, and then after that stroke, he ended up leaving. And so I feel like, you know, growing up in a food insecure household changes when it's like 2 parents, and then it goes down to 1 parent, and then that 1 parent, they're busy working and trying to support the family. And so you're kind of like, what do I eat? And why aren't there groceries? And it's because, you know, I was poor, we were poor, and we also didn't have time to go grocery shopping. So yeah, I guess that's just a little bit about my background with food insecurity and some of the experiences that I've had. But I'm sure that I'll mention more later on.
You actually kind of, I just had like a little bit of a flashback that I haven't thought about in a really long time, just to share. Because I know before we started recording, I was saying like, well, I never experienced like hardcore hunger, but there, you know, the thing about like my mom cutting out the coupons to get like, you know, the biggest bang for her buck for like the already super cheap food section of the grocery store. But I just had this little flashback as you were talking about that, of my mom saying, just drink water, because there actually were numerous times. And I think I just sort of blacked it out in my memory. But like, because also having grown up kind of poor, I mean, I don't know if that's like a common thing amongst poorer households, but like your parents just saying like, well, we don't have any food for dinner, just drink water tonight. Like tomorrow we'll have dinner, you know?
Yeah.
Like that's wild to me that like while we're recording the podcast, I'm just remembering that. But that did happen at least a few times.
Yeah, well, in terms of child development, one of the ways that children feel that the world is a trustworthy place is that their basic needs are met. When they're hungry, they get fed. And if those needs aren't met, a child gets the feeling that no one wants me, that nobody will provide for me, that the world is a dangerous place. And food insecurity can lead to a post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as, of course, nutrition is important for the brain to grow. 0 to 2 are the most crucial times for brain development, and 0 to 6 are very important. And if a child is not fed nutritious food, then it's much harder for the brain to develop. Plus, if there's no one home, children have to amuse themselves by sitting in front of a television or something else which is not particularly enlightening or helpful. So you're basically striking children down before they're old enough, striking them down with a fear that no one wants me, nobody will provide for me, I am alone, the world is untrustworthy, and also humiliating them if they go to the lunch line and are refused. They're so humiliated they wouldn't try again. And there are teachers that if the parent hasn't paid their milk money, won't let the kid have a little milk. And I know that when I was younger in New Haven, there were teachers that I was very close to as part of our political movement who used to stop at the day-old bread and cakes manufacturer that was near us and pick up huge bags of pastries and things and get gallons of milk out of their own pocket just because their kids couldn't pay attention if they were hungry, and they had to get it for everyone in the class, or else the kids who hadn't eaten would never admit it because they would be socially stigmatized. And these were kids starting in kindergarten who couldn't pay attention. They were jittery and nervous and upset because they were hungry. And so when we look at the stats, we're really looking at an ocean of misery. And that was before the pandemic.
And I think that when I was a child and kind of trying to figure out how to like navigate my life, I guess, more or less without reliable parental direction, one of the things that I found myself doing, and I reflect back on this a lot as an adult, was that I would go to my neighbors and I would hang out with my neighbors' kids, but also I would talk to my friends' parents a lot, kind of about my issues, and I thought really what I was doing was normal, and just like part of making friends, but also like I relied heavily on my my neighbors to feed me, and if I know that there are times when I knew that if I didn't have those relationships, that there were days that I would have gone without eating. And a lot of the times, if, you know, on the times when my mom was kind of like in between paychecks, I would ask her, you know, oh, I'm hungry. Do we have any food? And she was like, oh, well, you can make something, and kind of just like, you know, toss that, you know, like my need for hunger aside. And I think that also I was really discouraged from asking for help because, well, I'm not sure why, you know, it's not something that I really talk with my mom about. But part of me thinks it's because there's a lot of shame in seeking help for hunger, because it's a basic necessity, and there's a lot of shame behind not being able to provide the basic necessities for yourself and also your family. And even though like families experience hunger higher than, you know, families or households without children.
Well, a lot of parents too, in their shame, get angry at the child for asking because it puts them in the position of having to admit that they can't feed their families. And they don't have the political consciousness to understand that's not their fault. Often it's not their fault. And so they turn on the kids who know not to ask, because in addition to being hungry, they'll have a raging parent on whom they depend. Frank McCourt, in his, I think it's in Angela's Ashes, but it may be in his second book called Tis, he describes as a kid with a mother who's alone and really can't provide, going to his neighbor's house for dinner, his friend, and everyone got a heaping plate full of mashed potatoes with a pat of butter on it. And he said, Jesus, there must be some mistake, Holy Jesus. I don't belong next door. This is my really family. Steak here, switch me. And that's just because he got a plate of mashed potatoes and a pat of butter on it. You know, it's a sense I don't belong where I am. They can't feed me. They can't care for me. Where do I belong? And a sense that you are abandoned, because you are. The system has abandoned you to hunger.
Yeah.
I didn't plan on like talking about my own experience, but like this more stuff is just coming up, so it's sort of relevant, I think, in that I haven't looked into the statistics on this, but also with like crime and maybe juvenile delinquency and stuff like that. Like me and my friends did actually steal a lot of food growing up too. Like I'm just kind of realizing, and I always just thought like, well, we were the poor kids, we were the bad kids, and all that, and that's typically like the narrative. I mean, the middle class kind of white kids from where we went to school would always call like where we grew up the ghetto, even though I don't even really know what that means. Like usually just meant there's a lot of black people where we lived, but like it also just meant like poor people. But we did actually like steal a lot of food, and we, I sort of like I didn't get sucked into the criminal justice system. There's like a lot of luck there for me, but my other friends did. And kind of looking back, I still have this narrative in my own head sometimes, as probably a lot of people do, is like, well, we were just making a bunch of bad choices, and we were kind of, grew up on the wrong side of the tracks, got involved with the wrong kind of people. But I actually do wonder how much hunger plays a role in like the early sort of trajectory toward quote unquote criminal behavior, right? Where, because there's probably this like big confluence of factors, like cognitive functioning isn't fully there. So even knowing, you'd be able to do a risk assessment, like, will I get in big trouble for this or not? And just the simple thing of like, well, if I steal it, I can eat it, and I don't have to be hungry anymore. It's like super basic, as well as getting into selling drugs or whatever else is sort of whatever hustle is around you, because you're like, well, if my parents can't buy me food, maybe I can hustle to make a little extra money so I can buy my own damn food and solve the problem, right? But then there's like all these other sort of I think the inevitable, I don't know if it's a slippery slope or what, but like once you enter into that lifestyle, you usually don't turn, if it works well, it's reinforced, right? So you're probably going to keep engaging in whatever that kind of hustle lifestyle is, not just to solve the problem of hunger. Hunger may have been like one factor there, but you're probably going to kind of stay involved in that, right? And I know for me and my friends, that was certainly true.
Yeah,
and I've worked with, I mean, I've worked with a ton of teens, like from the clinical perspective now, where I've kind of seen that stuff play out as well. But I don't know, Tati, if that's something that in your research and work or lived experience, if any of that resonates in terms of like turning to a certain, I don't know, lifestyle, or I feel like lifestyle is the wrong word for it, but I think you know what I mean.
I think that I was, it was like really tough on the days that I didn't get to see my neighbors, because I did like, I previously said I heavily relied on them to kind of like sustain me, I guess, or like physically with food, because that's, I knew that like, oh, if I don't go to my friend's house, then I might not eat. And I feel like that sounds kind of bad, that like maybe I was using them or something, but no, I wasn't using my friends for just so they could feed me. But I think that it's also some like part of this like need to kind of like have a community there to kind of like help elevate the people who are experiencing hunger and poverty. But in one of the case studies that I sent you all, there is actually a story of a single mother with two kids who experienced like a lot of physical and sexual abuse as a child, and eventually, they were experiencing hunger, and they actually did end up turning to like stealing in grocery stores, and they kind of put that experience in a bad light. And I think the person who was doing the case study, or the researchers, asked them like, well, were you afraid of getting in trouble? And they're like, no, it's kind of like this hustle mentality. Like, I have to survive. And if I get arrested, then at least my basic needs will be taken care of.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
At a younger level, when I was a Head Start teacher, there was a little girl, she must have been about 4, and she was the biggest problem in the class. She wouldn't talk. She wouldn't touch any other children. When we went on a walk, you had to hold someone's hand and be in a line so nobody got lost. And she would line her hand with boogers, so, which was clever, actually. So nobody else would hold her hand. And I got to know her, she wasn't exactly forthcoming, but slowly I gained her trust by putting little snacks in front of her and walking away. And it turned out when we looked into it that she was hungry and ashamed and upset, and she didn't want anyone to know. She had been told by her mother, don't you tell anything that goes on at home.
Yeah.
Won't you tell? Because you'll be taken away from me. And then what will happen to you? And she was terrified. So she couldn't even touch another child or trust anybody lest she talk. And that's directly related to the stigma of hunger that's often felt by adults who can't provide, as well as by their children. And this is really, it's an atrocity in America. We're such a rich country that we throw out 31% of our food, and that we don't have a way of feeding people, of meals on wheels, especially during the pandemic. But outside of the pandemic, and Tati, I'm sure you didn't only befriend people because of food, but part of the friendship is that they were there for you for food.
Yeah.
It's part of the bond. I think the reason the little girl kind of melted for me was because I gave her food every day. I mean, not a huge sandwich or anything, but a little something, an apple, an orange, a banana, something, a little box of raisins, so that she could associate with me with a friend who didn't humiliate her for being hungry.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a really good point about parents telling their children not to talk about what they're experiencing at home. That is something that I experienced, was that my mom would say, oh, don't tell anybody about this. And I would ask why, and I never really got a response, but it's because of that fear that, oh, your child is going to get taken away. Or, even in my younger years, when like when my dad would hit me, he would say, oh, call the police or call this person or do this or that, and your life will be a lot worse than it already is now. And so, I kind of just ended up giving up until after he left and I was in high school, and I was like, I don't need to listen to him anymore. And, if I ask for help, then it's only going to make my life better. And, I mean, and so like I kind of like strategically figured out like the people who I can have in my circle who will like protect me and kind of not really like tell anyone who would like quote unquote like take me away or put me in like the foster care system, I think is what they're kind of like inferring to. But I mean that was definitely my experience, and I wonder how many other people who like have experienced abuse and neglect and kind of like these situations of hunger who have had the same thing happen to them.
Well, in AA and in the 12-step programs, they say that you learn 3 basic things. Don't tell, don't feel, don't talk, but really don't know. It ends up that you can't know what's happening, because if you know, you could tell. And if you tell, you're betraying the family.
Yeah.
And so it means that you have to repress a whole lot of what's happening in order not to be abandoned completely, rather than just abandoned in terms of food and care.
Mm-hmm.
It's a threat.
Yeah.
That hungry kids in homes that are worried, or in abusive, it happens also with abusers like your father, that kids can't afford to know what they can't talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they can't say it, and therefore it's too dangerous. Much too dangerous.
I always kind of hate this this feeling I get where I see both sides. Where like I feel so bad for the kid, having worked with like kind of high trauma kids for like 5 years, but then also working with the parents and like feeling so bad for the kids, but then also feeling so bad for the parents.
Yeah.
Where like I feel so bad for the parents that like don't know a way out, like they don't know how else to, the authoritarian approach to parenting of just like, shut the hell up, I will hit you if you don't shut the hell up. No, there's no food. No, there's no way to get food. Done. And like usually it's like intergenerational trauma, but especially because of the cycle of poverty, it's like, I remember in that clinic where I worked, this constant like, well, we just need to teach parents parenting skills. And it was very helpful for the parents that actually could make the appointments on time, and they were actually open-minded enough, or actually were able to like focus themselves, right? They had their shit together enough to be able to like, just wait a minute, take a pause, don't react, blah, blah, blah. There's all these skills you can use. Super effective. But a lot of parents I felt there were too many barriers to get them to like overcome where they were at, so that they could like not be shitty parents at the end of the day, and not be ineffective parents. Ineffective parenting.
Yeah.
So
and you,
yeah, because
it came to the clinic, so they're way ahead of the norm.
Right. Because there's the other ones. Right, exactly. Well, because there's the ones that like, probably can't even get transportation to it, or they're working 2 or 3 jobs, and it is just inconceivable for them to get to the services. And of course, and there are like more they call like wraparound. I don't know if there's different language across the coast or whatever. We have like wraparound programs in California where you can get people to go on site, and it's not just CPS type people, but there's like these different nonprofits and government programs now where it's like sending in social workers and everything. But those, there's a lot of limits to that as well. We have just so many flaws in our system of how to like deploy clinicians to like families that are really suffering. And anyway, this isn't Tati to like, I'm not saying like, well, your dad must have had it hard or whatever. Because I could, I relate to that in a lot of ways from having the parents that I had. But when I zoom out and I look at like sort of the structural and systemic factors playing in here, it's just so hard to like, kind of like what Harriet said before, if we're the richest nation in the world, how is it even possible that not just that kids can often not have food on the table, but that the parents are kept from the ability to get food for their kids, right? Because in most of these cases, it's not actually the parent's fault, right? There might be some bad choices here and there, but like it has more to do with the cycle of poverty. So, I mean, I don't know if you guys have thought, I mean, Tati, if from your research or anything, but like, I feel like we're probably all in agreement here that it's like Harriet said earlier, it's not like there's not enough food in the US. There's plenty of food. A lot of it goes bad. There, like, what actually is like at the crux of the structural problem of why millions of kids aren't getting food, and millions of families have to go hungry?
Yeah, well, I think what it's the bottom line is that we are the most unequal society in the developed world. In 1970, we were the most equal. We're now the least equal society. So that since this recession has happened, the top 1% has had an 160% increase in their income, whereas the bottom 50% has had a drastic decrease in their income. And in a class system, things are class inflected. And so it's the bottom, 19% of Black families have food insecurity, 17% of Hispanic, and not because there's anything in their ethnicity, it's that they don't have the money. And I think, we have to look at the way class works with its emotional component. And one of the ways that this has been explored are these very famous Hess and Shipman studies, where they studied Black families that were well-to-do and Black families that were poor. And they found that Black families that were well-to-do, they asked them, what do you say to your kid on the first day of school? And the wealthier ones tended to say, the teacher is there to help you. If you need anything, you ask a question. Whereas the poorer ones say, you be good. I don't want to hear that you got in trouble. The teacher says something, you do it. And they gave these two sets of parents an Etch-a-Sketch to work out with their kid how to make a certain design. And what the poorer parents would do if their kid was making a design that didn't work, they'd say, no. Whereas the wealthier ones would say, if you do this, then the design comes out this way. If you do that, because there's a whole wealth of vocabulary, of causality. But people who are under stress and used to being commanded at their own jobs and in their own lives translate that on to their children. And so that a family who's experienced hunger can't say, I feel so bad that you don't have enough food. I'm trying. It's not fair. You're a good kid. And I'll see what I can do. And we're going to do this. That at least would give a child a sense that that child is trusted, that this person is trying to protect them. They would see us, that they're okay, that they're not to be ashamed, and their situation is not shameful. There's a whole class induction system that is translated through parents to children with these lines of dominance and subordination that combine with class. And it then devolves into the way people treat hunger. Rather than a discussed and worked out and commonly grieved problem, shut up about it, a command filled with shame.
Yeah. I think that also a lot of our, SNAP and WIC and a lot of people rely heavily on these programs. And I don't think it's because they're lazy, because most people who are on SNAP and these programs are working, and they're working full time. And I don't think that the problem lies within the fact that, low income people are lazy. It's that we're not getting paid enough for the labor that we're doing. And so in turn, it creates all of these issues that kind of oppress the low income communities. And a lot of that includes mental health issues that we eventually experience as a result of living in poverty. And so I feel like something that, just like myself personally, I think is really important is that, instead of having a system that only works like up until the 20th or the 25th of the month, and then you run out of food and you don't eat for several days, it's like, well, why do we have to rely on food that's being commodified for profit? Like, why is our food being used for profit? And why are we throwing away food that we can't sell? Like, that's just something that I don't understand. But also, I think it's the same thing with housing too. It's like, how are we going to eat if we don't have a house? Or like, if we do end up on SNAP and WIC, it's like, do we have somewhere where we can store the food? And it's like, if I go to a food pantry, and do I have a can opener to open the food with? Or if I go to like a community fridge, where do I store fresh food, and what do I make with it if I don't have a kitchen?
That's right, because what you're talking about is it's really something compensated for in social democracies throughout Scandinavia. For example, Denmark Denmark, the minimum wage is $24 an hour, and they have all sorts of social supports. Single mothers get special housing allowances and special housing privileges, and they have ways of making money so that their children are not in poverty. In France, which is more diverse and more, a capitalism, they have the same thing, all these benefits, clothing allowances for single parents and for people who are living in poverty, extra food programs, extra school programs. And so that not only are people paid better, but there's a social safety net. Because really, capitalism is a terrible way to meet people's basic needs for food, for shelter, for water. Those things should not be commodified. Those are basic survival things that shouldn't be on the market. So they're more than available to wealthy people who can throw them away and unavailable to people who don't have the money and their children. I mean, that's a capitalist atrocity, commodifying basic needs that way. And the way it works out is in the lives of children who are humiliated and starved.
Yeah. I think that eventually what happens to the children, like if they do end up getting out of poverty, which is extremely difficult to do, they end up like living and existing in this world that like doesn't necessarily understand their experiences, but also they don't really want to hear about their experiences because it's tough. And you also have like people working in the nonprofit world who don't have those experiences either. Right. So they're kind of like relying on these statistics about like hunger and poverty to do their work. And I think that like maybe there isn't a system that works for people who are in poverty because they're like kind of unable to advocate for themselves because they are trying to survive.
No, I think in a country that was responsible for its people, for their health, for their food, etc., you wouldn't have food as an unregulated commodity. And so that, I remember a study in which children in the poorest parts of New York City who basically ate bags of Doritos and Cheetos while they waited for their mothers to get home from work, if they had any food in the house, had as much nutrition every day as a starving Nigerian child who got a cup of lentils, because they're also getting food that's not nutritious. And that is a sin in our country. That is, it has to be dealt with. And the fact that Biden is going to have $15 an hour, which isn't enough, but only after several years, that's a bizarre thing for our country. 2/3 of minimum wage workers are women and often have children. What are you doing in the richest country in the world, where the richest people are getting richer? In many countries, there's a maximum wage as well as a minimum wage. And also, there are taxes that would prevent people like Elon Musk having hundreds of billions of dollars, or even Jeffrey Bezos having hundreds of millions of billions, that the United States has, I think it's 700 billionaires who could change the lives of the cities that they live in. But that's also an outrage of our tax system, because they can stash those billions in offshore accounts, which should be illegal. And if the government had questions, they could ask people like the Cayman Islands, where's the money? And do you want us to invade and find it? No, the American military is very destructive. Nobody's going to agree to that. Yeah. So that you can really stop that. The only problem is with a pay-to-play election system, which most other countries don't have. They don't allow private money in other democracies very often. Then someone like Cuomo the governor of New York, doesn't want to put a 1% tax on billionaires because he wants them to contribute to his campaign. He says it's because he wants them to stay in the city, but they'll stay in the city for the enticements of the city. It's a system, an interlocking, unregulated capitalist system that then ends up leaving a hungry child who's ashamed. It all works down. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about hunger. Thank you, listeners. We hope you support us on Patreon. And we understand that in these hard times, you may not be able to support us. We love you anyway. And we encourage you to share this program so that others can enjoy it and that we can be connected, which is very important. Also, if you have any feedback you want to send, any ideas you want us to discuss, or any feelings about anything we've said, please share them. We need your participation. Thank you. This is Harriet Fraud and Max Golding.
Thanks, everyone. Also, a big shout out to our patrons, First Winter and Sarah Turner. And of course, Liam, thank you for help with the editing and the social media. By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.